Late one evening, at the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, two Marines, Private First Class Loudon Downey, played by James Marshall, and Lance Corporal Harold Dawson, played by Wolfgang Bodison, are arrested for assaulting and killing a fellow Marine of their unit, PFC William Santiago, played by Michael DeLorenzo. At first it is assumed that they attacked Santiago because he reported Dawson to the Naval Investigative Service, NIS, for illegally firing his gun at a guard on the Cuban side of the island. However, naval investigator and lawyer Lieutenant Commander Joanne Galloway, played by Demi Moore, suspects that Dawson and Downey, who are otherwise exemplary Marines, were carrying out a code red, an unofficial act of discipline in which soldiers are submitted to methods akin to bullying in order to get them to improve their performance, toe the line, or follow procedure. Santiago compared unfavorably to his fellow Marines, being clumsy and lagging behind on exercises, and was socially ostracized. He denounced Dawson in an attempt to be transferred away from Guantanamo. Dawson and Downey are taken to a military prison in Washington, D.C. to await trial. Galloway requests to defend them, but the case is given to Lieutenant Junior Grade Daniel Caffey, played by Tom Cruise, a U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps lawyer who is inexperienced in courtroom litigation, but has a reputation for arranging plea bargains, which gives him time to devote himself to his passion for softball. It is indicated that he has a psychological fear about having to match up to his late father, Lionel Caffey, a leading attorney, who is regarded as one of the great trial lawyers of recent times. Galloway manages to get herself appointed as Downey's lawyer, thus playing a part in the proceedings. The third member of the defense team is Caffey's friend Lieutenant Sam Weinberg, played by Kevin Pollock, who is a top legal researcher. Caffey meets with the defendants and finds that they are of the strictest type of Marines, those that serve in a forward area and are required to take their duties very seriously. Dawson is tough and authoritative and believes in honor and duty. Downey, a simple-minded young man and an archetypal village idiot, is guided solely by his devotion to being a Marine and his dedication to his superior, namely Dawson. Caffey, Weinberg, and Galloway fly to Guantanamo Bay to examine the crime scene and to meet with the base commander, Colonel Nathan R. Jessup, played by Jack Nicholson, his executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Markinson, played by J.T. Walsh, and Santiago's commanding officer, Lieutenant Jonathan Kendrick, played by Kiefer Sutherland. Kendrick exhibits masked hostility toward the investigators and states that Santiago disrespected the Marine Code of Honor and it resulted in his death. Caffey senses quickly that Kendrick will be uncooperative. Later, at lunch, pressed by Galloway, Jessup denies that code reds, which are a violation of military guidelines, are practiced, but makes little secret of the fact that he sees them as a good way of enforcing discipline, especially on the front line. Jessup also tells them that he arranged for Santiago to leave the base for his own safety once his denunciation of Dawson became known, but that he died before he could leave. At one point, Caffey casually, and with slight disregard for military decorum, asks Jessup for a copy of Santiago's transfer order. Jessup says he'll comply, but also hostilely demands that Caffey ask with the proper acknowledgement of Jessup's rank as a colonel. Caffey is cowed into complying and Jessup happily agrees. When the defense team returns to Washington, D.C., they learn that Markinson has gone AWOL and is unlikely to be found since he is a veteran intelligence operative who can cover his tracks. In their interviews with Dawson and Downey only hours before Santiago's death, the team is told that Kendrick assembled the platoon and told them that they were not to touch him. However, Dawson and Downey revealed that Kendrick subsequently met with them again and ordered a code red on Santiago. They never intended to kill him, just to shave his head in order to teach him a lesson, but he died as a result of a rag being shoved into his mouth as a gag. The two called for a corpsman, medical officer, but they were too late to revive Santiago. The prosecution is led by Marine Captain Jack Ross, played by Kevin Bacon, who is a friend of Caffey's. Ross makes no secret of the fact that he has been given a lot of leeway by his superiors to close the case since Colonel Jessup is expected to take up an important post with the National Security Council, NSC, a lateral promotion that could be put in jeopardy due to the Santiago affair. In fact, Caffey may have been appointed specifically because of his reputation for plea bargains and the hope that the case would never make it to court. Ross offers a deal which will see Dawson and Downey serving just 6 months in prison. When Caffey puts this to the defendants, however, Dawson regards such a move as cowardly and dishonorable and rejects it, knowing that he and Downey will be dishonorably discharged from the Corps. He believes that he was doing his job and obeying orders and wants to make this point in court even if he and Downey end up serving a life sentence. Seeing Caffey as nothing more than a coward for making the deal and trying to avoid fighting the case, Dawson refuses to salute him when he leaves the room, failing to understand Dawson's stubbornness. And when Galloway informs him that she will be Downey's lawyer in court, Caffey at first decides to resign from the case, but after thinking things through he agrees to go ahead. At the grand jury hearing, he enters a plea of not guilty for his defendants. Galloway and Weinberg work long hours preparing their defense, which involves weeks of intensive research, discussions, planning, and witness preparation rehearsals, the latter being mostly for the slow-minded Downey's testimony. However, on the eve of the trial, Caffey concludes that we're gonna get creamed. The court-martial begins. During the cross-examination of other Marines from Guantanamo, called Gitmo by the recruits, it is established that code reds are standard at the base as a means of getting sloppy recruits to follow procedure, such as taking proper care of accommodation and equipment or completing exercises successfully. Santiago was clearly not up to the standards and yet was not subjected to a code red until the evening of his death. Corporal Jeffrey Barnes, played by Noah Weil, who has also been a recipient of a code red and whom admits he desired to perform one with his comrades on Santiago, claims that Dawson would not have allowed it. Ross tries to argue that code reds are not part of proper procedure for Marines at Gitmo. However, Caffey, snatching one of the procedural manuals from Ross, counters that not every aspect of daily life of a Marine is contained in the manual itself when he questions Barnes about the location of the mess hall. Ross smiles sheepishly at Caffey's unexpected tenacity. In his post-mortem report, the base physician, Dr. Stone, played by Christopher Guest, stated that Santiago died as a result of poisons on the rag used to gag him. These caused a condition called lactic acidosis which led to his death. However, Caffey gets Stone to admit that lactic acidosis could also be caused by other symptoms such as heat exhaustion caused by strenuous exercise. Caffey then produces a report by Stone after a routine examination of Santiago. It indicates that Santiago had respiratory stress and was supposed to be exempted from such exercises for a while. The fact that he was not exempted means that he could have died of heat exhaustion even if the rag was perfectly clean, but that Stone had to cover up his negligence. Caffey, however, is still unable to get the obstinate doctor to admit that he falsified his report of Santiago's death to cover for Jessup and Kendrick. Galloway makes a strong objection that also fails with the judge and is reprimanded by Weinberg. Caffey's effectiveness as a litigator strengthens as the trial progresses, and he proves to be a tough and clever cross-examiner, impressing even Galloway by the way he handles the proceedings. However, he is under little illusion that his clients are unlikely to be let off. They have never denied assaulting Santiago, so the best Caffey can do is persuade the jury that they did not intend to kill him and that they were acting under orders from Lieutenant Kendrick. Lieutenant Colonel Markinson, Jessup's executive officer, still AWOL since the incident, resurfaces in Caffey's car halfway through the trial. When Caffey was in Cuba, Jessup told him that Santiago was due to be transferred off the base for his own safety, but Markinson now reveals that that was a lie and that transfer orders were created as part of a cover-up after Santiago's death. Jessup wanted Santiago to stay on the base to be trained. He also remarks that though he cannot do anything about Caffey's appointment to the case, he can at least help him win the case for his clients. Caffey arranges for him to be placed in the custody of the U.S. Marshals Service in a safe location. He tells Ross about Markinson's reappearance and how he intends to use him as a witness. Ross suggests that Markinson, under extreme stress and tension, won't last. He also warns Caffey about trying to tarnish the reputation of Kendrick, a model officer. While cross-examining Kendrick, Caffey confronts him over the fact that he denied Dawson a promotion after the latter helped out a fellow Marine who had been denied food for several days for stealing liquor from the officer's mess. Under oath, Kendrick denies ever ordering Dawson and Downey to inflict a code red on Santiago. He stands by his commanding officer and his duty as a Marine and a devoutly religious man despite being rattled by Caffey's line of questioning. Caffey also receives reprimands from both the judge and Captain Ross for trying to smear Kendrick's exemplary record as an officer. A flashback shows a meeting between Jessup, Markinson, and Kendrick, set on the morning prior to Santiago's death. Jessup was annoyed at the fact that Santiago went above the chain of command when reporting Dawson to the NIS for shooting at the Cuban guard and was not up to doing the tough exercises required at the base. Markinson advocated that Santiago be transferred immediately for safety reasons. The other Marines could take revenge for his snitching on Dawson, but Jessup vehemently refused on the grounds that this would set a bad precedent which could weaken their defenses and cost lives. He also makes a grand and sarcastic show of suggesting that transferring Santiago would mean that every other Marine on the base would also have to be transferred and that the base should be closed. He decides that officers have a responsibility to ensure that all personnel are trained appropriately and that Santiago should stay for training. Jessup orders Kendrick to ensure that Santiago shows significant improvement on the next evaluation report, or he would be held personally responsible. When Markinson objects, Jessup, after dismissing Kendrick, berates and demeans him for questioning his decisions in front of Kendrick, a junior officer, and even implies that Markinson did it out of jealousy for the fact that, although they graduated in the same year and had similar careers, Jessup still outranks him. Back in the present, Markinson also states that Santiago could have left the base in a plane on the evening of his death, rather than 6 a.m., the following day as Jessup had claimed. Caffey is unable to find evidence of the earlier flight in the logbook from the Guantanamo airfield. Markinson believes that Jessup has been covering his tracks and also suggests that the logbook from the flight's destination, Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, could have either been altered to make the arrival disappear. Caffey storms out of the room, telling Markinson that he intends to put him on the stand. Back in court, evidence comes up which questions whether Kendrick ordered Dawson and Downey to carry out the code red, something the defense has always taken for granted. It now emerges that Downey was on guard duty and was late reporting back and not in the barracks at the time when Kendrick supposedly gave the order to Dawson. Thus it is the word of Dawson, who had a personal grievance towards Santiago, against that of Kendrick, a highly decorated, God-fearing officer. Markinson, rather than publicly dishonoring himself and the Marine Corps, pens a letter to Santiago's parents, blaming his own weakness for the loss of their son, dresses in full dress uniform and commits suicide with his own sidearm. Without Markinson's crucial testimony, Caffey believes that the case is lost and gets drunk. Galloway tries to convince him to summon Jessup to court and confront him. She believes that Jessup ordered the code red and that they have to get him to admit it. There is no evidence for this whatsoever, and falsely accusing a superior officer of such a felony could result in Caffey himself facing a court-martial which will ruin his career. Caffey loudly and harshly admonishes Galloway for suggesting such a wild plan, and she storms out of his apartment. After she leaves, Caffey reflects on his late father with Weinberg. Weinberg admits that, with the evidence they have, Caffey's father would never try to indict Jessup, but also says he would rather have the younger Caffey as lawyer for Dawson and Downey any day, considering the fearless manner with which he questioned Kendrick. Weinberg pushes his friend to consider if it is he or Lionel Caffey who is handling the case, and Daniel Caffey finally decides to put Jessup on the stand. He finds Galloway walking away in the rain and convinces her to rejoin them when he tells her about calling Jessup in for testimony. At another meeting at Caffey's house, a surprisingly rejuvenated Caffey tells his partners that they have to rebuild the case against Jessup himself. He also suggests that the obdurate and egotistical Jessup actually wants to confess he'd ordered the code red. When Caffey goes into his closet to find his lucky baseball bat, he's suddenly inspired by his uniforms hanging neatly on the rack. He leaves without a word and begins a new line of research involving phone records. He calls Sam with a new task. Sam has to go to Andrews Air Force Base. Jessup is summoned to court. Just as Caffey is about to start his cross-examination, Weinberg arrives with 2 airmen from the Andrews Air Force Base, which Jessup does not fail to notice. Caffey initially gets Jessup to confirm that he had arranged for Santiago to be transferred off the base for his own safety and that the earliest flight was at 6 o'clock the morning following his death. Hoping to prove the transfer order Jessup signed was bogus, Caffey then questions him over his travel habits. Jessup admits packing sets of clothes, including civilian and military, and various other items. He also admits phoning several friends and relatives in order to meet them while in Washington. Caffey then points out that Santiago did none of these things. At the time of his death, his clothes were unpacked and still hanging in his closet, and, after spending months in desperate and vain attempts to get a transfer, he did not contact anyone or make arrangements to be picked up at the airport. However, Jessup successfully outsmarts him by saying that he cannot speculate on Santiago's habits, and he especially belittles Caffey for pinning his client's defense on a phone bill. Caffey is struck dumb by this setback, and Jessup is about to leave with a triumphant smug when the younger and lower-ranked Caffey demands that he sit back down in the witness chair. Jessup also draws a reprimand from the judge when he slyly criticizes the judge's courtroom procedure. Caffey now asks if Jessup ordered Kendrick to tell the men not to touch Santiago. Jessup confirms the order and reconfirms that Santiago was to be transferred in case the men attacked him. Caffey asks if Kendrick or the men may have questioned the order and decided to take matters into their own hands. Jessup angrily rejects the suggestion, stating that as frontline troops, his men have to obey orders at all times without question. At this moment, Caffey points out that if Jessup's orders are always obeyed, then there was no reason to transfer Santiago at all. Momentarily stunned, Jessup tries to come up with alternative explanations for Santiago's transfer, which are torpedoed by Caffey, who demands to be told the truth, at which point Jessup explodes. "You can't handle the truth." Partly regaining his composure, Jessup defends his country in a forward area. Colonel Jessup does not see why Caffey, who has never been on the front line, should even question his methods from under the blanket of the very freedom I provide. Caffey should either thank him for protecting his country and his way of life, or take up a gun and do it himself. Caffey suddenly thunders back at Jessup with an increasingly hostile tirade of questioning, demanding that Jessup admit he ordered the code red. In a fury, Jessup yells that he did. At the prompting of Caffey and the judge, Prosecutor Ross places Jessup under arrest. Jessup is outraged and lashes out at Caffey, threatening him and accusing him of weakening the nation. Caffey simply expresses satisfaction that Jessup will go to jail for the death of Santiago. He later admits to Ross that the airmen were brought to court as a bluff to make Jessup believe that the defense had evidence of the earlier flight, which he covered up. Weinberg tells Caffey that the airmen would testify that they had no recollection of the flight from Gitmo landing. Kendrick will also be arrested for ordering the code red, committing perjury and conspiracy for participating in the cover-up. Dawson and Downey are found not guilty of murder but are dishonorably discharged for conduct unbecoming a United States Marine. Downey is confused, pointing out that Jessup confirmed that they were obeying orders, but, after getting over the initial shock, Dawson points out that they failed to stand up for those too weak to stand up for themselves, like Santiago. As the two prepare to leave, Caffey tells Dawson, "Harold, you don't need to have a patch on your arm to have honor." Dawson, who had previously refused to salute Caffey, who he saw as a coward, now announces there's an officer on deck, and they exchange salutes.